Have you ever wondered how this was done? This is a 3D clone trail, and in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to do this in Adobe After Effects. So here are a few things you got to keep in mind when filming this. The first one is you gotta zigzag. This ensures that your poses don't block each other. So when you're moving from one pose to the next, you gotta either zig or you gotta zag. Next, you want to make sure you use a gimbal or just have very steady hands, because any jerky movements will cause issues when you're trying to track this. And whether you're shooting this in portrait or widescreen, shoot in 4K because it gives you more room to crop in later if you need to. In terms of lighting, whether this is indoors or outdoors, just make sure that it's well lit and try not to film against the sun because flares could cause issues with the tracking. Also, you want to be in a high feature area. You want stuff in the background because After Effects needs that to do the tracking. So you wouldn't want to do this in, like, say, a white-walled studio, for instance. And finally, try roughly keeping the same distance to your subject when you're filming. All right, so assuming you have filmed it, let's get on to the After Effects part. Now, I do go a bit fast on this, but you can always pause the video at any time. And I've also divided this up into chapters. So let's do it. All right, let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is drag our clip to our timeline. Now, the most important part is save your work. Also, I recommend you trim the start and end of your clip to only the parts you want. The effect we're using is going to be very computationally expensive, so you only want just the amount of footage you're going to work with. Otherwise, you're going to be sitting here and waiting a while. You'll see what I mean. So now we want to figure out how the camera was moved in real life. To do that, we're going to use the 3D camera solver. You can find that in the effects and presets. If you can't see it, go to Windows and make sure effects and presets is enabled. All right, so we're going to search 3D camera tracker and we're going to drag that to our clip, and immediately it's going to start analyzing the background. But before we let it continue, expand the advanced tab and click this thing called detailed analysis. What this does is improves the accuracy, and you kind of have to click this at the very start. Otherwise, if you click it later, it's going to start analyzing it all over again. I find that it works pretty well without it, but I take it anyway just because it doesn't hurt to have that extra bit of accuracy. So my computer says this is going to take 22 minutes, so it's time for a break. All right, so we're done. So let's click our 3D camera tracker, which will enable these track points to be visible. These are high feature elements in our video that After Effects has done a pretty good job of tracking. And it's doing some clever maths to use these to create a 3D camera solve. It's figuring out how the camera person actually moved the camera in 3D space. All right, so we're going to create our 3D camera by clicking this button, Create Camera. And that has created a 3D camera. I'll show you how to do this for one pose, and it's basically rinse and repeat for all the other ones. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a copy of this. I'm going to delete this 3D camera tracker effect from that. I'm going to rename that to copy. And that's what I'm going to be using to continuously duplicate for all my poses. And this one, the one that has the 3D camera tracker, we're going to rename to base layer. All right, so let's copy this to copy layer and let's move it up and let's rename that pose 1. So let's go to where we want our pose 1 to be. I'm going to pick right here. And what we want to do is we want to right click, go to time, and go freeze frame on our pose 1. So that means that this particular frame is now what we're going to see from this pose 1 layer. Next, we're going to cut this right here. To do that, you can go Control-Shift-D or Command-Shift-D, or go Edit and Split Layer. We're going to delete this top layer that it's created. After Effects is trying to be helpful by renaming it pose 2, but we don't really need it. And now if we zoom in, we're going to do something that you're going to need to do for every pose that you make. Remember this is really important. We're going to move this out by 1 frame. That's very important because if you didn't, when the playhead is right here, After Effects effectively sees nothing. It doesn't see pose 1. Let me disable base layer and to copy, and you can see there's nothing here. There's only something here if I move back or if I move this frame out. So I'm going to give it that extra frame. Remember to do it every time. All right, let's enable our layers again. So we're going to use the pen tool to cut out our pose. And this is effectively like using a pair of scissors and cutting out a figure in a magazine. All right, so it really helps to have a mouse with a middle scroll wheel because this is going to make my job easier. I can zoom in and out like this, and I can use the middle mouse button to move my frame like this. And what we're going to do is we are going to just start cutting. Now, something to watch out for is creating a second mask. So it's really helpful if you go to this masks drop down, open it up, and keep an eye on how many masks there are. Because if you accidentally create a second mask, that's not a good thing. So make sure that there's only one mask here. If you accidentally start creating a second mask, then delete that second mask and just continue on with the first mask. So it's helpful to try and get it as accurate as possible, because that means it's just going to look a lot better. But if this is your first time and you just want to see the result, then you can probably do this a little bit faster. When I did this the first time, I didn't do it that accurately. And the thing is, you can always go back and adjust this mask later on. So don't worry if you don't get it exactly right. So there's one more thing to do. Expand mask 1 and add a little bit of feathering. I like to add just 1 or 2 pixels, nothing much, just to smoothen the edges. All right, now we're going to make this a 3D object. So to do that, click this square over here and it makes it a 3D layer. Next, we're going to go back to our base layer. We're going to make sure we click on our 3D camera tracker to get all these track points visible. And we're going to zoom in to the ground just to see what's a good point that we can pin our cardboard cutout to. I'm liking this green one over here. We're going to switch to the selection tool because we're still in pen tool. We're going to right click on our green track point and we're going to click create null. We're going to rename that null to pose 1 null. A null object is basically an invisible object. And what we're going to do is parent our position and scale of pose 1 to pose 1 null. So open up the transforms of both like that. And an easy way to just filter it down to what we want is the keyboard shortcuts P and S. So just to work with position, I'm going to hit P for both. And we're going to use this spiral over here and drag it to the position of pose 1 null. And it's asking me to hit refresh. There we go. And now our cardboard cutout is a little Kesha over here and it's pinned to that null position. We're also going to pin the scale because it means I can control this cardboard cutout all from my pose 1 null. So we're going to hit S. That's going to enable scale. And once again, I'm going to drag this spiral thing for scale to the scale of pose 1 null. So now if I modify the scale of null or the position, it's going to influence my cardboard cutout. All right, so now for what is probably the most tedious part of this tutorial, and that's to make this little Kesha match this big Kesha. We need to ensure that we do 2 things to make our lives easier. 1, make sure that you've added that extra frame. Remember we did that earlier. And 2, I'm going to set the transparency of pose 1 to 50%. So I'm going to hit T to get opacity, or you can just use the drop down and open up transform. But I like to use keyboard shortcuts. And we're going to set that transparency to 50. This makes lining things up a bit easier. Okay, so the goal is to get little Kesha in the middle of big Kesha and then scale up from there to match big Kesha. So we're going to move that up. Now, a bit of a warning. We've got X, Y, and Z coordinates because remember, this is a 3D object. Do not touch the Z coordinate. We don't want to move it back and forth because that's what the Z direction is. We only care about up and down. So once it's here, I'm going to switch to scale by hitting S, and I'm going to make it bigger. And like I said, the aim of the game is to get it center and then continue to scale it up. And this will take you trial and error to get it right. But eventually you'll get good at it. And now we're going to zoom in, and what we're going to try and do is alternate between the top here and her shoes just to make sure that it's all aligned. So we can see that the shoes are a little bit higher, but the eyes are a little bit lower, which means all we need to do for now is just scale it up a bit more. See that? It becomes sharper when we get into alignment. So let's go down. So the shoes are a little bit off, so let me see if I can fix that. All right, so now the eyes are a little bit off. It's starting to look really good. Now, ideally, you want to get everything perfect, but if there's anything to give a little bit more priority to, it's the eyes, because that's what our brain will naturally follow anyway. But I'm still going to try and get it as close to perfect as I can. And this is looking pretty good now. So the shoes are good and the face is good as well. Now remember to set our pose one's transparency back to 100. So let's play that back and see if it lines up really well. Boom. So that's looking pretty good to me. I'm going to do one other thing to give it a bit of realism, and that's to add some motion blur. We can tick this square over here, and what that means is it gives it a bit of blur matching the camera's movements, and then boom. That's looking pretty good to me. Now, it isn't always going to be easy to get this alignment going, and after a lot of trial and error, I figured out why. When this was filmed, I don't think the camera had a lot of left and right panning or rotation. It always stayed looking straight front, and all the camera person did was move sideways, left and right. But sometimes you're going to have a bit of rotation. And what that means is sometimes when you create one of these poses, it's going to be rotated slightly off. So if you're finding that you're using scale and position and it's not aligning, then start adding some rotations, some X, Y, and Z rotations to see if that helps. And the easiest way to tell that you're going to have an easy time is to actually look at this bounding box. So this bounding box is actually planar to the camera. I'm not sure if this is the right technical term, but basically, is it flat without any rotations? You'll know it has rotations if it looks something like this. We can tell by the bounding box that it's actually rotated. And the best way to tell that it's planar is if we make sure that this line is parallel to the top and this line over here is parallel to the side. So if you're having trouble, just rotate it around until it looks planar. Great, so all we got to do now is do the other poses, and all you have to do is use this to copy layer to copy paste and keep renaming, which is very important because it makes our lives easier. So once you're done cutting up all your poses, you want to make sure that you're bringing them in at the right time because you don't want them visible throughout the whole thing. What you'll get is situations like this where cardboard cutouts will block what's actually happening. So you want to do something like this where you only activate them out of frame just as they're about to come on, like this. But there are times when you can leave them in there. For example, I'm leaving pose 2 in there because it creates this cool depth effect and also tells the audience that there's more to come. But when you do that, make sure you add a little bit of camera blur to create that realism of depth. To do that, you can go to Effects and Presets and add Gaussian blur or camera lens blur. So you want to use keyframe animation to automate the blurriness so that it's blurry to begin with, and as we get closer, the blurriness disappears like so. And at other times, you may not be able to get the cardboard cutout completely out of frame. So you can do a little bit of a sneaky fade in like that, which won't be that noticeable, or just simply crop in. All right, so once I was done, I took it over to Adobe Premiere. I added a bit of color grading, as well as a bit of keyframe animation, cropping in and out, just to give it a little bit of extra spice. And here's the final result. So that's obviously not the whole thing because there's a part where she does the whole dance. You can check that out on her Instagram page. It's pretty cool. So I hope that tutorial was useful for you. If you liked it, I'd appreciate a like and a subscribe, and let me know in the comments what else you'd like to learn from this channel. And I encourage you to give this one a go because it's pretty fun when you get it right. So until next time, stay safe and go make epic shit.